So welcome everyone to the Global Education Colloquium. As the Dean of the School of Education at Drexel University, it is my pleasure to welcome you today. The Colloquium is a monthly event series highlighting the work of distinguished scholars, graduate students, education leaders working in the field of global and international education. It is a place for us to share work on education and research, policy, practice in relation to education access, equity, quality around the world. We represent diverse disciplinary and interdisciplinary perspectives, including history, sociology, philosophy, psychology, economics, political science, public policy, and anthropology, and probably so many more. Contributions span from micro to macro levels of analysis, qualitative and quantitative research methods, and theoretical to applied orientations. What we have in common is a shared commitment to producing rigorous scholarship aimed at understanding educational institutions, educational processes, and the social and cultural factors that affect them from a global perspective. Our goal is to illuminate education, whether studied locally, globally, or internationally, as shaped by and with the potential to shape social, political, and economic change on a global scale. Having hosted over 60 speakers since 2013, we are delighted to announce a new book series further highlighting their work. The first 2 volumes are in the works. You can find all the past speakers' presentations archived on the School of Education website and learn more about the book series and future events. And now, let me turn it over to Christy Kelly, who will introduce our speaker today. Thank you for joining us. Christy?
Hey, thanks, Penny. Welcome everyone to the Colloquium. If this is your first time here, we're super excited to see you. And today we have a very special guest. We're excited to have with us today Dr. Garnett Russell. She is an associate professor of international comparative education at Teachers College at Columbia University. She also directs the George Clement Bond Center for African Education and is affiliated with the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, the Institute for African Studies, and the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia. Her research explores how countries rely on the education system to promote peace building and transitional justice, and how they use global models around human rights and citizenship. She draws on a sociological disciplinary perspective and mixed quantitative and qualitative methods to investigate questions related to education in post-conflict contexts, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, including Rwanda and South Africa. She's also conducted research on human rights and diversity in New York high schools and the right to education for urban refugees in Ecuador, Lebanon, Kenya, and other countries in the global South. She has several new projects in the works, and we're really hoping that she'll share a little bit of information about those at the end of our presentation today. Dr. Russell is a leading scholar in the field, having co-founded and served as former co-chair of the Education Conflict and Emergencies Special Interest Group of the Comparative International Education Society. And I see many of you here from that SIG. She also is a member, she's also served as a member on the Interagency Network for Education and Emergency Education Policy Working Group. She currently serves on the editorial board of the Journal on Education in Emergencies and the International Journal of Human Rights Education. Today, Dr. Russell is here to share research from her recently published book, which you can see on the screen here, Becoming Rwandan, Education Reconciliation and the Making of Post-Genocide Citizen. Her book was published in 2020 with Rutgers University Press. Please help me welcome Dr. Garnett Russell.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kelly, for the introduction, and also Dean Hamrich for welcoming me here today. And it's so nice to see everyone. I see some students, former students, even one of my former professors. So hello. So today I'm going to share my recently published book, Becoming Rwandan, and I'm happy to answer questions after the talk, of course, about my recent projects as well. So I want to start with a quote from a teacher who I will call Emmanuel, and the names are all pseudonyms. So Emmanuel is a political education or a civics teacher working in an elite government school in the capital of Rwanda in Kigali. And when I interviewed him, he told me the story of how he hid during the genocide in his neighbor's house, who was a Hutu, and how, as a survivor of the genocide, he really struggled to teach about this topic. And he told me that even his colleagues who were Hutu were even more afraid to teach about the topic. So this is a quote. When we talk about the history of Rwanda, we must pay attention to avoid hurting the souls of others because the hearts of certain people were hurt. We must be neutral, even if it's difficult. If a student poses a question that deviates from this usage, we must bring them to reason, bring them back to the center. And I think this quote kind of sums up the research and this idea that there is this tension that teachers face when they are teaching to a classroom at the time of the research, a classroom full of survivors of the genocide, returnees, those who recently returned to Rwanda after the genocide, and children of perpetrators. So this is kind of what teachers are up against. So this book emerged from my dissertation research in Rwanda, and also from my broader research interests on how countries that have undergone violent intergroup conflict use the education system to create a new citizen, and how they draw on these global models around peace building and human rights to address past conflict. So there are two guiding questions that my book seeks to understand. So one, how can the education system be used to address a violent past? And how are global models used and interpreted at the local level? So, so there are two bodies of literature that inform my research. So one is the research on the nexus across education, conflict, and peacebuilding. And while there is a lot of literature that investigates the positive and negative relationship between education and conflict, there are fewer empirical studies that have looked specifically at how education systems are being used to promote peace building and reconciliation. So more recently, at the global level, the United Nations has highlighted the role of education and youth specifically in promoting peace building. So SDG, Sustainable Development Goal 4.7, mentions a culture of peace, and SDG 16 focuses on peace. The UN Security Council Resolution 2282 talks specifically about the role of youth for peace building. And there have also been recent studies from colleagues in our field, the field of international and comparative education, specifically looking at how education systems can be used to promote peace, reconciliation, and transitional justice. So the other body of literature that informs my work comes from the sociological neo-institutional body of literature, and also the political science constructivist work. And these studies are really focused on the rise of these global models linked to human rights, citizenship, and peace building. And most of the research in this tradition focuses on cross-national quantitative studies at the national level study. And my research is really interested in how these broader global norms are implemented both at the national level, but also at the subnational level by local actors, particularly students and teachers. So I'm interested in the national discourse as presented by government officials in policy documents, textbooks, and curricula, but then how teachers and students engage and translate and reframe these global models. So the main argument I make in my book is that the Rwandan government uses global models in national policy documents and materials, but then the way in which teachers and students engages with these models really changes the original purpose. And I call this decoupling. And this is really where there's a disconnect between the global policies and discourses and then the way in which they're implemented or understood at the school level. So for my study, I draw on the case of Rwanda. And Rwanda is, as you're very well aware, the site of the 1994 genocide. And the genocide was an example of extreme conflict where more than 800,000 Tutsi and 10 to 30,000 moderate Hutu were killed in the period of 100 days. And this was more than 3 in 4 Tutsi and approximately 11% of the total population. So now it's been more than 27 years after the genocide, and Rwanda is often held up as a model of success. So they've achieved most of the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs, particularly in the area of health, education, and gender equality. They're often held up as a model because they have the highest proportion of women in parliament in the world. They've also seen economic growth, and they've also been relatively stable. And moreover, they, in their documents, in their education documents, in the curricula and textbooks, they do integrate human rights and peace building. So following the genocide was ended by the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and they were mainly comprised of Anglophones who had been living in Uganda, and they formed the post-genocide government of national unity. And this government was very much focused on unity and reconciliation in the post-genocide period. So there are several things that this government did in order to unify the population. So one is that ethnicity became taboo. So previously we heard people identified as Hutu or Tutsi or Twa, but after the genocide, that became increasingly taboo, and to the point where people didn't feel comfortable using those terms. Another was control over the historical memory and the way they talked about the genocide. So right after the genocide, it was just referred to as Itsemba-Boko, Nitsemba-Tsemba, meaning the extermination of an ethnic group and the massacre. And then after 2000, they started using the French term génocide. And then after 2008, they specifically started talking about the genocide against the Tutsi. And then another law that was passed, the genocide ideology in 2008, talked about this idea of genocide ideology, which is defined as an aggregate of thoughts characterized by conduct, speeches, documents, and other acts aiming at exterminating or inciting others to exterminate people basing on ethnic group, origin, nationality, region, color, physical appearance, sex, language, religion, or political opinion. So this is a very vaguely defined law. It received a lot of criticism, so it was revised in 2013, but there is this law, and a lot of my participants were fearful because of this genocide ideology law. Another initiative that the government implemented starting in 2001 was meant to address reconciliation on a broader scale, and this was the Gacaca courts, and these were based on a pre-colonial traditional conflict resolution structure, and Gacaca means justice on the grass. And this was meant to address the overcrowded prisons. So there were more than 130,000 genocidaires in the prison, so those who committed the genocide. So this is just to keep in mind as a background to what's happening in the education sector. So there's evidence that in the pre-genocide period, education fueled intergroup conflict and tensions across the ethnic groups. So there was discrimination, there were stereotypes in the textbooks and the curricular documents, and there was also unequal access to schooling. And during the genocide, the education system was destroyed. So most of the schools were destroyed, and more than 2/3 of the teachers either fled because they themselves were implicated in the genocide, or they were killed. So in the post-genocide period, the government really sees education as a tool to promote reconciliation and this unified national identity through numerous reforms. And education is viewed as a solution to these past conflicts. So this is just an example from the education sector strategic plan. Education at all levels is an important means of addressing issues of peace and reconciliation in the context of Rwanda post-1994. So there were several education reforms that happened around the time that I did my research that were really important in terms of how the government was using education to shape their sort of peace-building narrative. So one was this expansion of access to basic education. So they expanded it first to 9 years in 2009 and then to 12 years in 2011. And this is really important because previously education wasn't widely available to everyone. And so this was a way for them to expand access to education to everybody. The other thing was purging the old curricula. So they got rid of old curricula. Some of the teachers told me that they burned old textbooks. So it was really important that they start fresh. So they created a new civics curriculum. They received funding from the UNICEF and ICRC. There was a new curricular documents, new textbooks, and also history. So history was especially controversial. And after the genocide, there was actually a moratorium on teaching about the genocide. So there was no history curriculum, and that went on for a while. So the government started working with UC Berkeley and Facing History and Ourselves to develop a new history textbook, but that there were some disagreements, and ultimately the government chose to adapt an official narrative. So the textbook didn't come out until 2010. So that was another important reform that was going on. And then the third thing was also very important, was this abrupt switch from French as the medium of instruction to English. And this happened in 2008. And this was very much seen as privileging the Anglophone Tutsi minority, because the majority of the teachers, the majority of the people had been educated in French. So this was seen as a political move because there were issues with France. So this was also going on around the time of my research. So I conducted research in secondary schools in 3 different districts in Rwanda, and it's really important to keep in mind that there's a lot of regional variation. So I conducted research in the capital, Kigali, but also in the eastern province and the western province. And I did this because I hypothesized that there would be differences in terms of the languages spoken, so either more French or more English, the population who was living there in terms of survivors of the genocide or returnees from these neighboring countries, namely Uganda, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Burundi. And so that was something that was important for my work. So in terms of the data and methods that I used, I relied on a multi-level mixed methods research study. So I was very much interested in these global influences, but also transversal influences and looking across the different research sites. I conducted fieldwork. I spent approximately 11 months across several years, several trips. And I started at the national level. So I wanted to talk to the informants, interviews with government officials, with academics, international organizations. And then I also looked at policy documents, curricula, textbooks. And then I went to a school level to really see what was happening in the schools. So at the school level, I conducted surveys with 536 students in 16 schools, secondary schools across 3 districts. And then from that, I conducted interviews and observations in 7 of these schools. So I interviewed 109 students, both in groups and individually. And then I also interviewed 20 teachers and 7 school directors. And I also spent time observing teachers. So I observed classes where they taught about these issues. So for instance, history, political education, this class called General Paper. And so this was how I was able to triangulate my data. So, using different sources, and I'm happy to answer more questions about the data and methods if there's interest. And I should say also that I never directly asked about ethnicity because, as I mentioned, that's very taboo. So I used different proxies to sort of get at ethnicity, and it came out in different ways, and I can talk more about that. So today I want to talk about my findings, and my findings emerged in terms of sort of 3 different paradoxes that emerged. So one is around citizenship and how the government is trying to construct this unified Rwandan citizen, but at the same time, the past and this idea of ethnic identity is still strong. So there's this tension, right? Second is when discussing human rights. So there's very much a focus on social and economic rights and also gender rights, but then civil and political rights are sort of, not always respected, I should say. And then the third is around reconciliation and how they talk about the genocide. So the government very much wants to promote an official memory around what happened in the genocide, but this in fact detracts from their goals for reconciliation and peacebuilding. So the school is very much seen as a site to produce this new national identity. There's very much a focus on unity and reconciliation. So de-emphasizing ethnicity, there's the new flag that they created, a new national anthem, a new language of instruction, English. And there is very much an effort to create this new citizen that's very much globally oriented. So I argue that while the state is intending to produce this new generation of globally oriented and English-speaking citizens who don't care about ethnicity, in fact, what the education system is really doing, it's producing more of a nationalistic and obedient citizen who's afraid to be critical of the regime and of the past, and really to speak openly of the past. So this is a quote from a student I will call Olivier, and he is Francophone, and he returned to the country, and he is in the Eastern Province, and he says, "In Rwanda, all Rwandans are the same. There are no Tutsi or Hutu or Twa. We have become one. We are Abanyarwanda, Rwandan." And this sentiment was very common, both from my students and teachers. So this idea of erasing ethnicity, so there's no ethnicity now, we're all the same. This came up a lot in the interviews. So this is very much in line with the government's project to create this new Rwandan citizen and this idea of Rwandanness. So Brubaker calls it state-framed nationalism, and it's very much this non-ethnic identity that in the case of Rwanda is linked by a common culture and language, so they all speak Kinyarwanda. Yet at the same time that they're doing this, there's also the promotion of ethnic terms in certain contexts. So when they talk about the genocide, as I mentioned, the genocide against the Tutsi, and then access to certain clubs and scholarships are only for genocide survivors. So this creates tensions and boundaries that emerge at the school level. So while students never explicitly self-identified using ethnic terms, the way they talked about their experience during the genocide, for instance, if they were survivors or if they'd returned from Uganda or the DRC or Burundi, was often code for Tutsi. And then if they received funding or they were part of the Association for the Survivors of the Genocide, that also was a way that they distinguished themselves from others. And then language, interestingly, emerged as a boundary. So where you were living during the genocide. So if you were an Anglophone versus Francophone, that was actually more important than your identity. And this was seen as linked to accessing resources, right? So since all the school was in English now, being Anglophone gave you an advantage. So this quote is from Francois, and he's a history teacher in a school in the Western Province. And he says, amongst themselves, they cannot say that they are from such ethnicities, but on the inside, they know it well because at school, there are survivors of the genocide. So this is just a teacher telling me that, yes, the students can't talk about it openly, but they know inside because their families talk about it, their communities talk about it. So, and also, you know, this idea of being a survivor is very much part of the reality in the discourse. So the second paradox that I want to talk about is about the way the government uses human rights norms and discourses. And this is an example from one of the textbooks. It's a history and citizenship book. And here you can see that they are learning about human rights, but it's very much emphasizing social and economic rights over more contested political and civil rights. And that's because the government has put a lot of effort into expanding access to basic education, to healthcare, but then at the same time, they've very much limited other types of rights, particularly political and civil rights, so freedom of speech and that type of thing. And the government is very much promoting certain types of rights, like women's rights and gender equality. So, so interestingly, when I analyzed policy documents, so when I was looking at policy documents related to education and the social sector, I looked across 8 different documents, and gender, for instance, was mentioned 196 times in all of the 8 documents, whereas human rights was mentioned 22 times in 5 documents. So they do talk about human rights. It's there, they mention it, but it's very much superficial, whereas there's much more emphasis on gender equality, and then these social and economic rights. And I argue elsewhere that this is, and other scholars have as well, that this is, their focus on gender equality and women's rights is very much a way for them to seek support of the donor community and, we're doing all this great work, and avoid scrutiny of human rights violations and ongoing ethnic tension. So this is sort of one way of avoiding addressing that directly. So this is a quote from a student, Juliette. She's an 18-year-old Francophone returnee, and she's at a school in the Western province. And she says, I believe that human rights are somewhat respected, but here in Rwanda, not everyone has the right to express himself or herself, because there are moments where you say something and go directly to prison for 25 years. There are things that we cannot say above all about our history, about the genocide. It's necessary to be prudent. So this quote is, to me, very striking because on one hand, she says, we do have human rights in theory, but maybe not in practice. And she refers to this fear of going to prison. And this is related to what I mentioned earlier about this genocide ideology law, which pervades, this fear of speaking openly because you can be accused of inciting violence. And she herself is a returnee, right? So even if she's afraid, right? So this quote sort of demonstrates that fear. And so the third area of tension that I wanted to talk about today is really this idea that on the one hand, the government is trying to promote this idea of reconciliation and unity through this official narrative around the genocide and around reconciliation. But in doing so, it's actually suppressing open discussion about genocide, about the ethnicity, and that's limiting efforts at reconciliation and peacebuilding among students and teachers. So this is a quote from Paul, and he's a general paper teacher in the Western province. And he says, we must follow the official narrative. We can't diverge from the program because we can't lose time. And also with the history of Rwanda, which is controversial, we must know how to best address it. And I think this quote very much points to an issue that came up in this, how do you talk about these sensitive issues in class? How do you confront the genocide? How do you confront, the different versions of what happened? So I think this really points to it, and that some teachers just wanted to avoid talking about it entirely because they were afraid that they might say the wrong thing, that they might be accused from their students of something. So this is sort of a common sentiment that I found. But the government is very much focused on promoting the memory of the genocide. So this idea of Kwibuka is the memory of the genocide, and every year there's an annual commemoration of the genocide that starts on April 7th for 100 days, and this banner here says, remember the genocide committed against the Tutsi, upholding the truth, preserving our dignity. And it's very much this idea that Rich talks about of an official collective memory, or Limashan talks about as an enforced memory. And this also happens not only in formal education, but also in non-formal educational spaces. So there is a program, Itorero, which is a mandatory civic education for all teachers, civil servants, and youth, where they learn about the official history. And also Ingando camps, which are known as re-education camps, where returnees and soldiers go. So, so this is all happening as well, and in addition to what's happening in the formal education system. So, so I find that this official narrative really constrains open discussion and genuine reconciliation. And when I surveyed the students, I asked them about their idea of reconciliation. And interestingly, I found differences in variation across regions, types of school, and by identity and reconciliation. So for instance, it was higher in government schools, higher in the Eastern province, where you have a lot of returnees coming from Uganda, higher for genocide survivors and returnees, and also higher for girls than boys. And again, this all points to the difficulty about teaching around these issues. So this quote is from a student, Vlad. He's an 18-year-old student in the Western province. And he says, reconciliation will not come quickly. It will take a long time. Just like how the Hutu learned to hate the Tutsi, this took a long time, from 1959 to 1994. That can't be overcome easily. This past is still in people's heads. So I think it's important, even if ethnicity is socially constructed, it still has material consequences, and it's still linked to access to resources, and it's still part of family histories and family narratives. So I think what I found is that it's challenging for students and for teachers alike to move on and sort of forget about this past. So in terms of my conclusions, so what I found is that the attempts to promote national unity and reconciliation and this official collective memory are there, but there are these counter narratives that exist, and there's really a lack of political space for open discussion and for critical thinking around these issues. And interestingly, while I didn't find a sort of binary Hutu-Tutsi divide, I did find new cleavages and boundaries emerge by language group and by their experience during the genocide. So even though on the surface it looks like Rwanda is integrating these global models around human rights, around peacebuilding into the documents, I do find this decoupling between the way that they're intended to be understood and then how teachers and students are engaging with them in the classroom. And so I think the findings really point to the difficulty of using education to socialize students, particularly in these post-conflict contexts, and also this idea that education is sort of a solution for a conflict, that it can solve all of the problems in a divided society. So in terms of policy implications, I think this work really points to the difficulty of promoting peace building and human rights in post-conflict, and particularly in non-democratic contexts. So it's not really enough to include peace building and human rights in your documents or your policies. You really need to think about how you implement them in practice. And I think it also points to this idea that education is inherently political. So the curriculum, the language policy, access to quality education, all of this is politicized, and it really matters. So the amount of time they talk about these topics. So even though Rwanda includes this in their curriculum, they don't devote much time to talking about these topics, right? And then practices at the school level continue to promote other narratives. So I think all of this is really important to think about. And then another thing that comes out of this is really the critical role of teachers and teacher identity, their own experience. That's really important in how they're able to teach about these topics. And the lack of support and professional development for teachers and addressing these difficult issues, I think, comes out as well. So, so just to conclude, I think that my work has implications not just for Rwanda, but for other contexts, other divided societies. So I want to just end with a few sort of open questions that we can come back to perhaps in the discussion. So can education promote reconciliation and unified civic identity in the absence of a politically open environment? And to what extent is education contributing to sustainable peace in Rwanda and in other contexts? So I think this work has led me to do research in other contexts, and I'm happy to talk more about that. So research in South Africa, research in the United States, and research in Colombia. And what I'm finding, across all these different contexts is that there are a lot of similarities when you have these divided societies and the difficulty of teaching about these issues. So I'm going to end it here, but I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. It was really a wonderful overview of an incredible research agenda and book that we're all looking forward to reading if we haven't read already. We have plenty of time for questions, conversation. So I invite folks, if you'd like to raise your hand, and Garnett, if you want to just call on people, or if you want to put your questions in the chat, we'll go from there.
I have a question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I found this presentation very, very enlightening, very interesting, and my research interest, as Dr. Kelly knows, very similar research interest. And so I was listening to your presentation and this tension that you identify between ethnic identity and this promotion of a unified national identity. and how that kind of, while it's promoting peace on a certain level, at the same time it's suppressing identity affirmation, which makes me question about what it might look like. And, you know, it's, I guess, a philosophical question, not one that I'm sure that we have the answers to, but I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on the path forward? You know, if we were to supposed to say, okay, well, identity and ethnic identity affirmation and expression should be one of those human rights on that the list of human rights that they're looking at, right? What then are your thoughts if teachers or other educators or policymakers were supposed to start pushing that agenda? How do you think that would perhaps influence the context of Rwanda right now?
Yeah, thank you, Nisha. That's a great question, and I think, yeah, you kind of, that goes right to the heart of the tension, right? So on one hand, you know, if somebody wants to have this ethnic identity, is that their human right? So I think it's really hard. I think in the case of Rwanda, the government has sort of decided that they want to get rid of ethnic identity because they want people to see themselves as Rwandan, right? So this national identity before their ethnic identity. And it's interesting because in Burundi, they haven't done that. So in Burundi, they still have ethnic identity, right? So, so I think it's hard. I mean, I think on one hand, yes, it's good to talk about how ethnic identity is socially constructed. So I think in Rwanda, they talk a lot about how it has, you know, colonial origins, and the Belgians created these very rigid ethnic groups. And that in fact, the groups were much more fluid. So I think what the government is trying to do is sort of break away from this very like rigid view of ethnicity and say, like, we're all Rwandan, we all have the same language, we have the same culture. The Hutu and Tutsi, that was linked to, you know, but whether you owned cattle, right? So, but unfortunately, ethnicity, even if it's socially constructed, it's still in people's minds, it's still real, right? So I think that's the tension. And I think you see, you know, similar discussions happening in South Africa, post-apartheid, right? They talk about, yeah, you know, these groups were created during apartheid, but, you know, we don't necessarily, you know, some people reject the labels, but then on the other hand, in order to provide redress for groups, you have to identify. So I think it's very hard, and I think, yeah, I don't think there is really a right answer. I guess what I would encourage, and sort of what one of the teachers I worked with in Rwanda wanted, he himself was Tutsi and had lived in Burundi, and he said, I think we should just talk about it openly and about how it is socially constructed, but that people still believe this and it still has real consequences. So I think that sort of, I liked his approach. I thought the way he saw it was good. I think just not talking about it and making it taboo, making it illegal is hard, because then there's a lot of fear, and that's sort of what comes out of my work, is just this fear to talk about these issues, and I don't think you can really get past them if you can't talk about them, right? So that's sort of, that's what I would say. But thank you so much. That's a really important question.
Thank you.
I was struck in listening to the presentation and having watched the news this week with like moves to reconcile the French-Rwandan relationship, how similar the Rwandan reconceptualization of citizenship was to the French conception of citizenship, like less focused on religious, but more on ethnicity. And I was wondering if that came up in your research at all, that they drew from like a French model or French conceptualization of citizenship, as opposed to a more American conceptualization of citizenship, or if it was just in direct response to the genocide.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. That's really interesting. So they definitely, if they did, it wasn't intentional, because there is very much a distancing from Belgium, from France. I mean, France wasn't even a colonial power, but they blamed France for their involvement in the genocide. And a lot of the students thought that, you know, France had been the cause of the, you know, there was a lot of sort of sentiment around that. So I don't think they intentionally were modeling themselves. If anything, they were very much focused on, you know, an Anglophone orientation. So they joined the East African community and changed everything to English. And so, but it's kind of ironic, right? That that is this coming from the French approach, and you know, we're all the same, we're all French, and but I don't think they, that's interesting. I'm not sure, but I don't think it was intentional.
Garnett, you have a question from Bob. I don't know, Bob, if you can open your mic or if you'd like us to read your question from the chat.
Sure. I'll ask it. I was just wondering because I didn't hear much discussion from the perspective of the teachers and the students related to their perception of whether, you know, those colonial structures and legacies were, you know, sort of the cause of some of the problems that they're still facing. And then also this concept of austerity that has driven a lot of the current concepts of nationalism and citizenship. I was wondering if you got any inkling from the students or teachers that you interviewed, whether that was something that they really thought about and talked about in schools, or whether that was sort of taboo as well to talk about in the educational setting.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So yeah, definitely there was this intentional effort by the government. So when they talk about the genocide in the textbooks, they do frame it as the genocide was caused by our colonial history. And I think part of that is, you know, there is truth to that, because the Belgian colonial powers did separate the groups, and that created tension. They, you know, unequal access to education, and then that continued, you know, even after independence, but then the Hutu were in power. So I think the history and the colonial legacy definitely plays into that narrative, and that's something I heard in the schools. You know, it was in the curricular documents, in the textbooks. I heard that from teachers, from students as well. I think the part that is problematic, I would say, is that the government sort of says that it's all caused by the colonial powers, whereas I think there were other things going on. It was a bit more complicated, right? So unequal access to resources and you know, competition over political power. And so I think what happens is that it just becomes this sort of like, oh, okay, we can blame it on the colonial legacy. And that's an easy way for the government to not really address ongoing issues or ongoing inequality, I would say, between the different groups. So yeah, it did come up. I think more nuance is necessary in terms of really understanding the impact of the colonial legacy.
I have a question from Alvin.
Hi, good afternoon, Garnett. It's so great to see you. Hi. So excellent presentation, and I just have a question regarding one of your interview methods, or your method of interviewing government officials, and sort of what was their level of openness in talking about these prevailing issues and the policies pursued by the government of Rwanda regarding identity post-genocide. And I suppose the reason why I ask this is because there's always that looming factor of speaking freely and the lack of democracy and etc. And the big elephant in the room, Paul Kagame. So I'm just curious to know, what were their views? Were they giving sort of responses in line with the government stance, or those that reflected the general society, may it be in favor of the Rwandanness or looking at aligning with different ethnic identities?
Thanks so much for your question, and nice to see you. Yeah, so I mean, I started the project wanting to speak to government officials to understand their perspective. And it was, yeah, to be honest, it was challenging because I think a lot of them didn't want to speak off the record. You know, it was very much like the official line, and this is kind of what it says in the policy document, and that's what we do, right? And I did speak to some of the people working on curriculum development and textbooks. I tried to speak to some of the higher up officials in the Rwandan Education Board, and they wouldn't respond to my emails. You know, they didn't want to speak with me as a researcher. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's just hard. It's hard to be open about these issues if you're in that position. And I understood that, so I didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable. So I think in terms of like the rapport that I was able to build with the teachers and the students, that's because I spent time in the schools, you know, over months and observing classes and had informal conversations in the hallway. I mean, I always say a lot of what you learn is just spending time with people and chatting with them informally. So it's not necessarily during the formal interview that you're recording. It's sort of just, they'll tell you something like, oh, by the way, you know. So I think to me, yeah, it's really difficult to sort of get candid information, I think, from high level officials, particularly in this context where things are tightly controlled, and you know, there could be repercussions for being critical. Right?
Thank you.
Thanks.
On the question about methods and methodologies, I'm going to use my prerogative here to ask another question, and that's, you know, when you were starting out, this field was still a very new field. You know, figuring out how to do this kind of research in these kind of contexts in school and formal and informal settings was still very new. How would you advise people today who are embarking on these kinds of longitudinal or in-depth or ethnographic kind of research projects to think about their research design, how they build rapport, how they work in post-conflict contexts? What have you learned now that you would tell the next generation of scholars to think about?
Yeah, thanks so much. That's a great question. So yeah, I mean, I think a few things. So one is just, I built these relationships over years. So I didn't just show up and you know, assume that people would tell me things, right? I studied Kinyarwanda. I mean, my Kinyarwanda is not very good, but I did make an effort. I think that's really important. I speak French, and that helped, I think, build rapport. But so I think language is really important, just spending time getting to know people. And then I did work with 2 Rwandan research assistants, and that was really crucial. I mean, they were amazing, and they really helped me sort of gain entree into the schools, and particularly with a lot of the students didn't speak English or French fluently, so some of the interviews we conducted in Rwanda, and so I think, yeah, working with local research assistants is really important. Building rapport, I think trust is really important. I think, you know, my status as an outsider, obviously, American, you know, non-Rwandan, in some ways helped me. I think people felt more comfortable telling me things because they knew that I wasn't going to report them. And I think really making sure that they knew why I was there. You know, at the time I was a doctoral student, and I would introduce myself, and, you know, I'm not here for the government. There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just here to hear your perspectives. I think that's really important, is being very clear, you know, the intent of your research. And then I think in terms of the post-conflict, I mean, it was a concern in Rwanda because I did have to be very careful about what types of questions I asked, how I asked it, making sure that my participants felt comfortable, felt safe, that their identity was protected. So that was something I was always very aware of. And I think in these post-conflict settings, it's even more important to think about issues of confidentiality and you know, protecting your participants, because there are real consequences. So that was something I was always, you know, thinking about, and making sure that I was doing all that I could to protect them.
Thanks. A good reminder always that context matters and that building rapport is not easy, right? But also you make a really interesting point about sort of the insider-outsider status in spaces and how to use your advantage, whether you're the outsider, whether the insider, and how that shapes data collection and analysis. Thank you. We have a question in the chat from Nisha, but I've asked her if it's okay if we hold off on that towards the end, since it's sort of the next generation of work. And I want to go to Essam if you have a question you'd like to ask.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was very enlightening, especially when comparing it to post-Arab Spring countries. So I'm from Libya and I'm researching post-2011 uprising, the national citizenship and whatnot. What I have noticed before, the socialist regime used to kind of be very anti-West, very so on and so on, but then anti also globalization. And now the new regime is all for global citizenship and uses this kind of global outward-looking perspective on citizenship, that we're all interconnected, we're all human. But with that comes in, as you have highlighted with your theoretical framework, the Mayerian theory from the Stanford School, right? And so that means that there's a lot of global homogenization of content and whatnot, and so on. And so have you noticed that there's kind of this push that there is a lot of standardization, a lot of neoliberalism in the sense of not just privatization, but also making everything kind of factoids based to so students could learn as much content as possible, as fast as possible, and assessed as fast as possible as well, because that's kind of our efficiency models in education nowadays in 21st century. And obviously that also has repercussions on the ability to have discussions, because if everything becomes factoids based, it becomes closed-ended as opposed to open-ended discussion about history. So have you explored these issues in education? Sorry for the long question.
Thank you so much for the question. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I didn't specifically look at that in my research, but I can just speak more generally from what I've noticed. So I think I also did notice this sort of emphasis on the global citizen and this global orientation. But interestingly, in the Rwandan case, they promoted that at the same time that they promoted this very much like nationalistic, Rwandan citizen. So I think the fact that, and I found in other research, I did a study actually with a colleague, and we looked at textbooks, and we found that these two models can coexist, which is really interesting. You think that one would displace the other, but in fact, we find that they're both present in curricula. I think in terms of the textbooks, I mean, they do get, they do have international consultants, so you are going to see sort of similarities across different contexts. And Rwanda took a lot from the East African countries, so Uganda, Kenya, and also now they've changed, the competency-based curriculum. So they're very much in line with other global trends that are happening. But when it came to the history or the civics, it was very much Rwandan. So I think that's also really interesting. Certain subjects were very much, up to the government to decide. And then others, they said, okay, we want this to be in line with what other countries are doing with global standards. But then when it comes to these very sensitive topics around history, around citizenship, that was very much had to be in line with the government narrative and not so much in line with global, global discussions around these topics.
Jennifer Adams.
First, Garnett, so thank you so much for being here. It's so good to see you here, and I'm so excited. Congratulations. I really appreciated Essam's question and also your answer to it, because I actually myself had been thinking about both the tension and also coexist, the way both globally oriented and also nationally oriented curriculums can sort of coexist with one another. And, in my own experience, I was actually thinking of the same tension that's occurring in China right now, where we see globally oriented education, emphasis on English and being global and cosmopolitan, but also really nationalistic education happening at the same time. And I was wondering if, in your experience in Rwanda, whether you found that there were any spaces that were sort of safer for being globally oriented. I think you just mentioned that history was not one of them, but I was just thinking, for example, you mentioned like the SDG 4.7 in the beginning. And so, for example, in the China case, I would say education around like climate change and the environment is a safe space for being more globally oriented versus nationally. And I was just wondering if there's a tension towards that in the Rwanda case, or are there any other places that you would consider sort of more safe space for thinking more like a global citizen?
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for your questions, and so nice to see you. So yeah, I mean, that's Yeah, I did find that, and it was really interesting because, you know, they do talk about these global orientations and human rights and certain things, but I think for them, their safe space is definitely gender, and Rwanda is all about the gender equality and all their achievements in gender, and in the schools, you know, gender parity and special programs for girls and STEM and all this. So I would say that that's definitely where they wanted to be part of the global discussion and sort of highlight their achievements and what they've done. And whereas when it came to more contested areas, for instance, talking about the way they talked about the genocide or the way they talked about human rights or things like that, they, you know, took a very specific Rwandan approach. But in terms of gender, yeah, that was something that was definitely framed in a very like global discussion. And look, you know, compared to other countries, we're doing so well, and Rwanda's a leader in this. And you know, they did make an amazing, you know, they made amazing progress. So I think that's something to, you know, to highlight. But I think they also use that sort of as a way to detract from other areas, perhaps. So, yeah, thank you.
So nothing on the environment or climate, just as a follow-up.
I mean, yeah, when I was there, it wasn't a big thing. I would say maybe in recent years, I would imagine that they started to include that more. Yeah, it was included in the textbook. So what struck me, I looked at some of the textbooks from primary school, and they're even starting to talk about these issues as early as like 4th grade. So yeah, I would imagine that the environment could be another safe area, but I didn't look specifically at that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In the last couple of minutes we have, I want to give you an opportunity, Garnett, to tell us about what's on the horizon or your other research projects and how they're connected here.
Yeah, great. And I'll try to address Nisha's questions. Yeah, so I've been working on 2 projects recently. So one, I did a research project looking at newcomer youth and resettled refugees in the US, and specifically in New York and Arizona. And this was around belonging and civic identity. So, but what came out of that was sort of similar to some of the stuff that came out of the Rwanda context, is just that it's really hard to talk about issues around identity, issues around current events, political issues. And this all happened, you know, during the Trump administration. So there were just a lot of topics that were sort of difficult to talk about in the classroom. So, so I think even in the US context, you know, we assume that we have a democracy and that things are open and that you can talk about these issues, but that's not always the case. And I think teachers felt like they couldn't talk about certain topics with their students, and that, you know, students didn't always feel comfortable expressing their opinions. So that was something that came out of that work that I thought was sort of relevant to some of my other research in post-conflict contexts. And then another project that I'm hoping to start as soon as we're able to do research in person it's in Colombia, and it's looking really at the education and transitional justice. So Colombia, they signed a peace agreement in 2016, and they implemented several transitional justice mechanisms, including the Truth Commission. And so the Truth Commission is supposed to teach about the conflict. So it's really interesting because the conflict hasn't really stopped. There's still violence. Then there's also the refugee crisis, the Venezuelan. So there's a lot happening down there, and there's still a lot of instability. There have been recent protests as well in recent weeks. So I'm really interested in how they're going to use the education system to sort of address the idea around peace building, but also transitional justice and sort of transitioning. So that's a project that I hope to be able to begin data collection in the near future.
Wonderful. Well, we look forward to inviting you back and sharing your research in progress and learning as you go. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise today. We'll officially close this session and thank everyone for participating in the Global Education Colloquium this year. Please do check us out next year and see who we have on the slate. And for those of you able to stay on, we have time for informal conversation now, but we'll just stop the recording. Thank you
Thank you so much.